Hey, PreSales Collective, it's your host, James Kaikis, and today I'm going to be joined by David Maloof, Global Vice President of Solutions Engineering at Salesforce. The topic of today's episode is called A PreSales Journey. And in this episode, David and I are going to talk about David's pre-sales journey, from starting as an account executive at Career Builder to moving into solutions engineering at Oracle, MRI Software, and now Salesforce. David's experience is wonderful because he's worked in overlay roles or specialty roles for his entire career. And we talk about solutions architects, business value, early stage programs and careers. And this is where David's experience lies. And so in today's episode, we'll walk through his journey, talk about some of his learnings, talk about some of his challenges, and get his perspective on how these augmented teams best support an organization. Enjoy. David Maloof, welcome to the PreSales Podcast. How are you today?
I am doing well. How are you?
I'm great. I've been looking forward to this episode. So thanks for joining us. It's great to have you.
Absolutely. Great to be here.
You are no stranger to the PreSales Collective. You're actually on our advisory board. We work together lightly at Salesforce. And so it's great to have you involved. I think before we get started, I am curious for you, why are you involved in PreSales Collective? What is in it for you, David?
So this is something that I really feel has needed to happen for a long time. I talked to a lot of other professionals in the field, and there's really been no central place for us to connect and catch up on topics. When things come up at your job and you want to be able to bounce an idea off somebody, but there's not really a lot of other people, especially in smaller companies, to have those kind of conversations. And so the fact that there's this global community now where all this comes together is amazing, right? And you'll hear a little bit later when we talk about kind of my journey, pre-sales really changed my life. And so the more people that we can evangelize this to, that's just something that's really exciting to me. So, thank you to you and the collective for putting this together and inviting me to be a part of it.
Thanks, David. And I'm excited to dig into your journey. And thanks for being such a strong advocate and ally to the PreSales Collective. Like you said, we're all evangelists, and we have to let people know what this role is and let them see themselves in this role, because I think it's the best profession that no one's ever heard of. And I'm hoping in the next 5 to 10 years that will change. People will know, and this will be a destination role. You mentioned your pre-sales journey. So, David, how did you get into pre-sales? Walk us through that journey.
It's not an easy question to answer. When people used to ask me that, I'd always say I had this kind of non-traditional path into pre-sales. But the more you talk to everybody, you realize no one really had a traditional path into pre-sales, because it's really a non-traditional role. It's interdisciplinary. There's all these different factors that go into it. It's not one set path on how to get there. So the unique slant to my story is really about the timing. So, like a lot of people out there coming out of high school, I wasn't in a position to take the typical 4-year full-time college route. So I started working right after high school. And it actually took me 8 years kind of working part-time here and there to finally get, my degree. And during that time, I was kind of all over the place. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't know pre-sales was a thing. So, the first 4 years, I probably worked about a dozen different jobs, taking night classes and things like that. And then I landed a job at Career Builder. And that's where I didn't realize at the time, but I actually started doing the pre-sales role internally at the company. So they hired me as an account manager, but I started looking around. I was like, why are we doing things this way? Like, there's technology that will do this for us. Like, why does everything have to be so complicated? So I didn't know I was running a discovery, but I'd sit down with my coworkers and I'd say, what's the least favorite thing about your day? What takes the most time and you think it's just a waste of time? And then I'd go online, I'd Google, and I'd start looking around for how can we solve this problem? I'd present that up to my leadership team and they'd be like, well, that makes sense to me. This is really cheap and it solves a problem. And I did that so often, they actually turned it into a new role and gave me a team and said, go do what you can with this. Keep solving these problems. So before I knew it, I was evaluating software. We implemented a CPQ tool, a workflow tool. We put live chat up on the website, and that started me down this path of product management. And then, the world turned upside down, right? 2008, December, market crashes. I found myself without a job, with no degree to fall back on. So I took out a student loan and said, I'm going to finish this off. I'm going to go back to school full time. And that's when pre-sales actually found me. So here I am, I'm back in school full time, student loan debt's piling up, and I participate in the sales competition that this company, Oracle, had sponsored. I didn't know what Oracle was, but after one of my rounds, this guy came up to me. And the best way I can describe it is like Neo meeting Morpheus in the Matrix for the first time. This guy literally walks up to me, sits me down, and he says, what if I told you there was this role in sales where you didn't have to cold call and prospect, and you didn't have to ever force a contract on somebody, but you just have to solve problems and give presentations? I kind of took the Oracle red pill, so to speak, and never looked back. And pre-sales really changed my life. it's been a great career path ever since.
David, that is an incredible journey. I love hearing that story. I always like talking to people who have very diverse experience in terms of being an account executive, a product manager, or an SE. So what was it about the SE role that was really calling you from like the PM world? Because you had already been an account executive and then you're doing product management, but what made you want to go back into sales?
When I went back to school full time, I started taking actually professional selling classes for the first time. And for the first time, I really saw the difference between what professional selling could be versus the way that it's perceived out in the world. It's all about problem solving and things like that. But the part I was still hung up on was I'm going to go knock on somebody's door that has no idea that I'm coming and try and sell them something. I couldn't wrap my head around that. So the way that this role was described to me, it was someone else does that part for you. And you get to do exactly what I had been doing at Career Builder, which was sitting down, talking to people, figuring out what they really needed, and then finding a way to help them and coming back and presenting them with that solution. So it's like, this is the best job that could possibly exist. I didn't believe it existed at first. I was like, sign me up. Like, let's figure this out.
Your story reminds me of my own in terms of like why I never wanted to be in sales directly. I just felt like trying to hit my numbers and sell something that maybe I didn't always believe in or the customer didn't need, just didn't motivate me the way that I want to be motivated in my work. And so when I found the pre-sales role, that same story just resonates with me. Being able to solve people's problems and be customer centric. That's really what it's all about. So David, I want to talk about your experience at Oracle, because at Oracle, you created and led overlay teams. And a lot of times there are people that are building their pre-sales function and they only have one type of SE. So can you talk about some of the teams that you created and the overlay roles that existed?
Yeah, absolutely. So before I jump into the roles that I kind of got to create of those teams, when I transitioned into Oracle, like I said, I didn't exactly know what Oracle was. I was still figuring out what an SC was. And the first year I was there, I had just missed the cutoff for what they call their early in career program, their Launchpad program. So the first year I got to just figure out what it really means to be an SC on my own. You need to do a demo for a certain product, you download a script, you learn it, you go and present it. And from there, I actually got to participate in that program the second year. I went out into the field for a couple of years and then had the opportunity to come back and lead that program. So a really exciting part of the journey was I saw how it impacted me, and I got to immediately start kind of giving that back and saying, okay, other people, I've been through this. I've been where you are. This is possible. And that sort of set off my path back into management, because at Career Builder, I was managing teams as well. But I always like managing the teams that are just a little bit different than everybody else, right? So anything that's already well established or is already in place, I don't want to say it's boring, but it's kind of table stakes to me, right? It's what else can we do? What else can we do differently? So when I started leading teams, I had a variety of the typical regional and product teams, but then I also got the chance to lead an innovation SWAT team. And that was just basically a blank slate to let us look across the business and say, hey, here's where we're doing really well. Here's some gaps. How can we help do things like build pipeline? How can we get people to adopt the product more quickly once it's sold? What can we do to continue training and developing people? So I got to create these teams that worked with the core teams to help solve some of those problems. We put together a team that did guided workshops, hands-on keyboard with the product. We put together a team that actually operated like a post-sale team almost for people that had just purchased the product, help them get up and running a little more quickly, got them more productive. I got to run some enablement programs for new hires and things like that. So all these things to kind of augment what the core teams were doing, in addition to running kind of the standard regional and product teams as well. So I like to have my hands in a lot of different areas, but I like to kind of fill in the gaps. And that's the part that has always excited me.
That sounds like you did a lot at Oracle. I love hearing that. That's really interesting, especially when you talk about things like the SWAT teams and the forced innovation. So what do you think it is, David, about these overlay teams, or the word used, augmented teams, and how and why companies should incorporate them to be an additional multiplier effect to the core team?
And you just hit it on the head right there. It's a multiplier effect. And that's the reason why. From Oracle, I went to a smaller company that didn't have a lot of the shared services and things like that. They're no fault of their own. That was just the path that they were on, right? Every company, when you start off, you typically have the AEs that are doing the demos. Then you kind of get to a point where you realize that you need SCs to do it. And then there becomes this point where it's, wait, we have way too many products. We have more than any one SC can do. How do we multiply that without just adding additional headcount? How do we take this great thing that we've got and start to really scale it. So I'll give you an example. At Oracle, they have a great organization focused on demo environments. And they have an entire team globally that just supports provisioning, updating, maintaining demo environments, things like that. At a smaller company, those demo environments are generally kept up by the SEs themselves. They might have their own instance. They might have one for the team. And they're going in and they're doing all the updates. And as more products get added, they're trying to manage integrations and things like that. And you reach this point where it's like they're spending more time doing that than being out in the field selling. And that's that inflection point. And that's where you start to need that shared service. So we can start bringing together things like environment access, starting to catalog the POCs that you built so they can be reused over time. We can take a look at some of the things like RFPs, right? There's great tools out there that can help automate that now. So you centralize those types of functions into a shared service. Then you're not just adding more heads out into the field and having everyone bogged down with doing this sort of back-end work. You have a team that specializes in that and is excited about that kind of work and can get it done for you to maximize what you're doing out in the field. And that's where the value starts to come in.
David, let me ask you a very specific question. I get a lot of people that reach out to the PreSales Collective, or I see conversations that are happening. When is the right time to bring in those augmented services? And sometimes they're like, oh, well, my team's only 50 people. We're not ready for it. But I've also heard people who say, hey, my team's 15 and we're ready for it. Do you have a specific number or perspective for those that are thinking about introducing this type of team?
Absolutely. And it's not necessarily about the size of the team, right? There's no number where you say, okay, we've hit this. It's more about where the team is spending their time. When you cross the threshold with more than 50% of an SE's time being spent on back-end processes and things away from the customer, that's when you really need to start taking a look at what can we do to scale this.
Perfect. I appreciate that. I'm glad that you had that response. Actually, at Showpad, we were only 10 people and we created a single augmented individual, one in the US and one in EMEA. And we were able to do so much when it came to art of the possible. And it really changed what our SEs were doing and what we're actually presenting to customers. We were able to do things a lot more expansive in the pre-sales process that we would just talk about that post-sale was really responsible for. So I love that perspective. You mentioned that you went to a smaller company and that smaller company was MRI and you were tasked with building out the shared services model there. How was that experience different than Oracle?
Well, it's really all the things that we just talked about. So it kind of reached that point where the SCs were running the demo environments themselves. They were building POCs on one-off cases. And then they went through this series of acquisitions. And all of a sudden, there's not just a handful of products. There's 10 products, there's 20 products, there's 30 products. And you start to take a look across all of these different types of environments that it takes to support that. And then, you start hearing conversations like, oh yeah, so-and-so built that for this demo, but they don't work here anymore. Or yeah, so-and-so, did this great thing for this customer, but it was in an older version or something along those lines. And then you start thinking, okay, we need to start pulling some of this together. And so you build content repositories for your POC data. You start to pull all of the environments information into one place and have it administered by people that, focus on that part of the business. And we implemented that, and it was just immeasurable, the impact that it had right out of the gate.
In terms of measuring that, was there something that you found that you measured early on that allowed you to continue to scale those teams?
Again, it's all about where the team is spending their time. So when you start to reduce the number of hours that are spent trying to integrate two environments together or rebuilding something that someone had already built before, but no one knew, what system it was in, those hours really start to add up. And when you start to see the increase in customer time versus the time spent on the internal measures, there's that cost benefit. You start closing more deals. You start having a higher attach rate. Those sorts of numbers start to increase that allow you to continue to build the case for why you need those resources.
That's great, David. I just think about how many times myself where I've heard others say, oh yeah, so-and-so built that, but they don't work here anymore, right? Like, oh my gosh, pre-sales people are so good about trying not to reinvent the wheel, yet we do it with demo environments or proof of concepts or workshops all the time. So I'm glad that you talked about that repeatable process because that allows us to accelerate, especially when our ratios are high. There are some organizations that have really high ratios, and those types of creating efficiencies and not reinventing the wheel every time will allow pre-sales teams to make an impact faster. So David, after your MRI experience, you went to Salesforce. Like, what was it about the Salesforce opportunity that was appealing to you?
So there were a few things. The first was a lot of the people that I had the opportunity to work with and train at Oracle over the years had been migrating over to Salesforce. And I kept hearing, this is a great company. They've got a lot of things that they're doing right. They're, the market leader in this and that. And it's just a really great group of folks. Like, you should make your way over here. So I always kind of had it in the back of my mind that that was a destination for me. Then a particular position opened up and I was reading through the description. I was like, I could have written this as like, this is what I would want my job to be. And it was a combination of what I was doing at MRI, some of the stuff I had done at Oracle. So that was the deciding factor that led me to make the move.
So when you came over to Salesforce, what were you specifically responsible for?
So there were three prongs to what I was brought over to do. So they called it Solution Studios was the name of the organization. And it was our global services organization, which they call Q Branch, much larger scale, but very similar to what I built at MRI. And it was the enablement team for SEs for North America. So again, kind of going back to some of the work that I was doing at Oracle and some of what I had done to help enhance processes at MRI. And then the third was their Scout Academy, which is their early in career program. So again, having gone through that sort of a program, gone back to teach that sort of program, having the opportunity to come back and do that again at Salesforce was something that was really exciting to me.
Would you say that there are specific challenges that you face at Salesforce that you faced at MRI and Oracle when it came to shared services?
Absolutely. The shared services team and enablement have since been realigned and they're in other parts of the business, but I'm still running these overlay types of teams. So right now I'm working with our business value team, our enterprise architects, and then I still have the Scout Academy. And with any of these types of programs, it's the blessing and the curse. In my mind, the further away you get from the core business, the more exciting the work is because you're often doing things that haven't been done before. You're looking at things a little bit differently. You're saying, how do we augment the business? How do we become that force multiplier? But the trade-off is every time you come up with something new, you don't automatically get that same amount of resources back. So just because you come up with 5 new offerings or you're doing these great new programs doesn't necessarily mean your staffing is going to match that immediately. So, making the case for why these teams should be treated differently, what the ratio should look like, what the type of investments needed to get them up and running and sustain them. Those are the types of challenges that you run into above and beyond what you would typically see with like a core SE team.
And David, PreSales Collective is starting to do more content around solutions architecture and value engineering and these specific functions and how they work with the solutions engineer or sales engineer. And so if someone were to come to you and say, David, why do architects and business value professionals live under a different roof and reporting structure than the solutions engineering leadership chain? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, my response would be, the base level, because they really are different entities. So we refer to our combined BVS and enterprise architect teams as strategic advisory services. And that's really how I view that organization. We're almost like a consulting firm within pre-sales. So we go in and kind of work with the most strategic accounts and the strategic engagements are really hands-on. We do a lot of things like workshopping. We're doing deep value analysis, really digging into the numbers. These aren't transactional things that we're necessarily a part of. And it's really a different motion. Everything from the way that our staffing models work, everything from the different types of engagements that we have. The two roles, the business value and the enterprise architect, actually have more in common with each other than they do with a core SE team. So putting them together just really makes sense.
So a company like Salesforce is really mature in the shared services model. But do you still face challenges at a macro level or a micro level that people say, well, this is the SE's job?
Yeah, absolutely. There's always things that you're going to come across that fall into that bucket, right? Why isn't the SE doing that? And in my mind, the SE shouldn't need to do all of those different things, especially as you start to add in additional products. There's a lot of things that are on the plate for a SE. And when you start getting into analyzing financial reports and getting into that level of detail or looking across systems architecture and having experience in that sort of depth, it's too much to ask one particular team to take on. So, having teams that are specialized in that depth to augment really help kind of all around.
Thanks for that, David. We had Chase Scholes from Salesforce.org on the podcast recently, and we talked about solutions architecture, and he did a great job of explaining the role of solutions architecture versus solutions engineer, because I've had a number of people come to me and say, I don't know the difference. Even for the PreSales Collective, I've heard of some organizations who call their solutions consultants solutions architects. And so when we created a Slack channel called Solutions Architecture, I received a half a dozen pings saying, how is this role any different? It's still this education phase in terms of how these roles can be different, how they could be the same. and really a difference. And you talked about depth, and it really seems like depth is the difference because, Todd Jansen says it, and I've referenced a couple of times, stop making unicorns out of your sales engineers. And that's typically what we're trying to do with these job descriptions.
Exactly. So, James, if you and the collective want to take on a challenge, if you can get the industry to standardize on some of these names for the different roles and what they are, that would be a huge win for the community.
There it is. Publicly putting me on challenge. I love it, David. At the end of the day, these are things that we would like to do. I think that's what the community needs because there's so much confusion. And we talk about, and not to get on this, right? But we talk about not reinventing the wheel within our own organization. But if you look at the profession, we're doing it across the globe, no matter if you have 100 employees or 1,000 or 100,000, right? It's quite interesting that we're still all reinventing the wheel, and that's okay. And that's going to happen. But I'm going to take on that challenge. I don't know if you're going to give me a time box on that. You might need to give us a couple of years, but I'll take that on, David.
Awesome. Looking forward to it.
We'll reference back to this podcast. I want to talk about the early career items because this seems to be a common trend that I'm hearing more and more of. And it's really exciting because we want people to want to be in this role. At Salesforce, you're responsible for the early in career, but you had mentioned earlier, you did some of this work at Oracle. Is that right?
No, absolutely. So I came in through this sort of a program and I know how it changed my life. I know how it changes the lives of people that are involved. I'm a big fan of the saying, if you fish in the same ponds, you're going to keep catching the same fish. And I feel like in pre-sales and sales engineering, we do a lot of fishing in the same ponds, right? When someone leaves or we get a new headcount, we go look to a competitor and we say, okay, who's someone that's been doing this for a while that we can pull in? And it's just kind of recirculating that same pond of fish, so to speak, which is great. Sometimes you need that level of expertise. But what these early in career programs really let you do is it gives you access to an entirely new stream. It's not just Oracle. It's not just Salesforce. I'm actually part of a cross-company organization that talks about these things. I mean, it's Cisco, it's Adobe, it's Google, it's everybody out there is having the same conversation of, how do we expand this pool and how do we bring new people into pre-sales? So it's an up-and-coming field that I think a lot of people are getting involved with, and it's really exciting to see how it's changing the future of solution engineering.
What are some of the non-traditional roles or professions that you've seen people come from?
Yeah, so I forgot to mention this earlier, but when I was doing the early in career program back at Oracle, I actually had the opportunity tangentially to that to take that sort of a program and apply it to training a new org that we were building out. We needed to hire 100 SEs. And so we took that curriculum and we adapted it to not just early in career, but experienced hires. We brought in non-traditional backgrounds. We brought in people like teachers, some people that had retail backgrounds. I think we even had a professional baseball player in one of our cohorts that went through it. And what we found is the curriculum doesn't really change that much. As long as you kind of identify and acknowledge that this is a different group of people. Some people have more experience in some areas and some in others. But when you take them through a process and get them to kind of clearly identify the role that they're playing in the program and things like that, and kind of address some of those teaming things up front, it's really powerful to see how they blend together.
That's incredible. I've said this before. Some of my best employees have been musicians or teachers or English majors. Those are things that I wouldn't have expected. I'm an education major, actually. It's non-traditional. And if you would have said 10, 15, 20 years ago, like, hey, you're going to end up in a technical sales role, I wouldn't have ever believed you. But I find that some of these people end up being the best pre-sales professionals because they're not salesy. They're customer focused and problem solving minded. And when they come in with that different perspective, they approach the role differently. And we continue to talk about trust and buying and selling, and all these things are changing at the end level. And so this role gets to be more and more impactful. I love that you talked about fishing in the same pond and finding the same fish, because how many times, you're right, does somebody leave and we go hit up the competitor or we call a referral and it's the same people getting the same jobs? We need to bring new people in. From my purview, David, one of the things I've noticed is that there are so many pre-sales jobs out there and actually not enough candidates. I've kind of dubbed this internally as the war on talent because it's really competitive out there. It's also hard for people to break in because companies want experience, yet they don't have the experience. So there's this weird conundrum that the profession is in. But for you, what is the early stage career program done for Salesforce in generating a pipeline and career progression?
It's really opened up, like I said, the candidate pool, right? We've got this great new group of talent that's coming in, straight out of school, at least for the early career program. and they bring fresh perspective to the role. There's not this conversation of, well, this is the way that I've always done it. They're, hungry. They want to learn more. They are quick to adapt to new technologies and pivot, on a dime. And we've, been running this program for several years now, and people have gone through it. They're out in the field and they're crushing it. And then what happens is they tell their friends about it. And the next class of people that's about to graduate, they have an interest in the program. So it's starting to kind of spread virally via word of mouth. And then, I know you've had conversations with the sales engineering.
National Society of Sales Engineers.
Bingo, there it is. So great group of people there that are kind of evangelizing this at the collegiate level, making people aware of what's going on. I actually call them the pre-sales collective.
Yeah.
They're doing what you're doing here at the collegiate level, and then they feed into these programs, and it's just exponentially broadened who we can bring into the program. But in my mind, that's just the first piece, right? Is the collegiate hiring. This non-traditional piece is really what I'm starting to focus on as well. Salesforce started something called Workforce of the Future. It's a program that I've been involved with, basically since I started. And it's saying, what are the core competencies that an SE needs? Does it really need to be as technical as it has been historically? You mentioned like musicians and writers and things like that. There's a performance aspect to this job, and people that know how to get up on stage confidently in front of people, make a connection. If you can get people excited about software, that's a no-brainer, right? I mean, software is not inherently exciting, but if you can find those people with that enthusiasm, it's a game changer.
It's so interesting when you talk about the reskilling aspect. I get a lot of people who say, hey, James, I want to get into pre-sales, but I don't have the experience. And all of these job descriptions are saying that I need the experience. And to your point around hey, does this role need to be technical or does it need to be biz savvy? We've had some debates with the pre-sales collective of biz savvy versus tech savvy. And I think as buying's changing, as selling, which I alluded to earlier, and then the addition of augmented services, you don't necessarily need that super technical resource that you needed before. Do you have any specific advice for those that are listening that are trying to get into a pre-sales function? They might not have the experience and they're not necessarily as familiar with any reskilling programs that exist out there, but how should they get into this profession?
The first thing I would say is take a look at what excites you, right? So one of the things that I recommend now to hiring managers is take a look at a person's resume and remove the job titles. And if you can look at what the person's actually done, you'll often find that what they're already doing is really closely aligned to the pre-sales profession, right? They may not have the title, but if you, as a candidate on your resume, have that you've given presentations, you've worked in retail and explained to somebody how an Apple product is going to make their life better, something about the technology. Have they been a storyteller? These are the kind of things that if you list these out as skills on your resume or bring them up in an interview, these are things that translate really, really well into this profession without even needing a baseline of reskilling. I mean, these programs and things that these companies are offering tackle a lot of that. But if you're passionate about the role and what you'll be doing, the experience tends to line up.
That's great advice, David. And, I heard somebody on an event talking yesterday that there are all these companies out there, Salesforce included, Okta, Cisco, that are actually offering certifications of their products out there on the internet for free or for paid. And so you can get that experience and you can learn the ins and outs, things like AWS, right? That you don't need to be a technical pre-sales professional to get those skills. So you're ideally better prepared for an interview process or better qualified once that opportunity does present itself.
Absolutely. I'd be remiss not to mention Trailhead, the Salesforce platform. A lot of free courses and things that you can go on and take there and learn about, not just the Salesforce program, but the ecosystem and things like that as well. So anyone interested in pursuing a career here, we've got that resource as well as all the ones that you mentioned at some of these other companies as well. There is stuff out there you can do if you feel like there is that kind of technical gap, or maybe you just don't know the space as well, or things like that. There's a lot of information online that's freely accessible.
As we talk about early stage professionals or career changers, this is a very hot topic for PreSales Collective right now. And it's something that we're really looking to explore. And so I will take you up on trying to define pre-sales titles. If you're willing to share information with me on what those core competencies of sales engineers are in the future. Because I think if we can help define that as PreSales Collective, it at least puts the guidelines and the frameworks together to give people a little bit more of a starting point. And so I'm curious, is that a challenge that you're willing to accept?
Absolutely. Challenge accepted.
All right. I like it. We're going to have to do a follow-up episode to just kind of see the progress and see where we're at. David, it's been a pleasure having you on the podcast. Personally, I've really enjoyed getting to know you, and thank you for all of your allyship and partnership in the PreSales Collective. It's great to have you involved and really appreciate your time today.
Well, thanks for having me. This was absolutely great. Look forward to doing it again one day.
Absolutely. Let's do it again. Talk soon, David.
All right. Thanks, James.
All right, PreSales Collective. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I'm very thankful to have gotten to know David through the PreSales Collective and very appreciative of his support as an advisory board member of the PreSales Collective. Hearing David talk about his experience is amazing. David was an AE and a product manager at Career Builder. And so he's got that experience of living in a different role prior to coming to pre-sales. And for those individuals who know the movie The Matrix, I love David's joke about taking the red pill and joining Oracle and becoming a solutions engineer. And David's experience as a solutions engineer is very broad and very diverse, but he's worked a lot with augmented teams and overlay support. And so for those out there that are determining, hey, should I introduce an augmented team, or you're an individual contributor and you're spending more than 50% of your time behind the scenes, it might be worth your organization looking at those overlay roles or looking at an augmented team that will allow you to focus more on customer engagements. As we talk about the early stage career programs and the reskilling programs, I like that David said, if you're fishing in the same pond, you're going to get the same fish. And that is all too true. So many managers out there get an open head count and they go to their network and their referrals and say, hey, who do I know that I can plug and play? Because keeping that head open is a hard thing to do and it impacts your business. And so it's always easier to go and dip into that same pond. And so the challenge that we will have for everybody is understanding how we continue to get different individuals from different backgrounds into pre-sales and allow them to be successful. I love David's challenge for PreSales Collective to help formalize and standardize the role titles, and then right back at him in terms of the core competencies for solutions engineers in the future. All right, PreSales Collective, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. As always, we will see you next week.